Hey everyone, it's Sean at the Ashland Fly Shop. I'm just going to walk you through a two-stage intruder that I've been really liking for winter steelhead on the coast. Yeah, here we go. Starting off, I like to use the Pro Tubes 4040 tubes along with a hook guide. This makes it really easy to kind of judge the size of your fly and know kind of how long to make all of your materials. So here's our hook guide, the tube. Just like slide them up onto each other. And I'm using Vivus 50D. So I'm just going to start laying down a thread base at the back of the tube. And I basically want to tie my materials all the way back to where the hook guide starts. That way it's going to be the same every fly you do. You're not kind of guessing every single time. All right, once I have that, I'm going to start with a dubbing ball. I'm not doing anything huge right now, just something to give a little bit of prop to the back. There's not a lot of materials in the back, so I don't want to, have too much going on back here, but just enough to prop up my grizzly fibers as well as all my other feathers in front of that. So start off dubbing loop. I'm going to be using ice dub and pearl. So with my ice dub, I just want to get a little bit out of the package, and I'm going to grab it with two hands and start pulling it apart. I want to get all the ends to kind of match up so that when I put this in the loop, every single fiber in the ice dub, or as much as I can, is actually in the loop and is not going to fall out when I spin it. So that's about enough. Might take out a little bit. Putting too much dubbing can make it harder for your fly to sink, so it's good to kind of keep an eye on that. Any dubbing spinner will work. Just spin your dubbing up. And since it's a dubbing ball, I'm not actually going to pick this out too much, but I'm just going to make sure that everything is spun through and is tight the way it needs to be. All right, I'm just going to wrap this. And since I've kept it tight, it really is going to make a nice bulky back station here. Or prop rather, for my back station. Make sure. All right, so there's our dubbing ball. Next on the list, we're gonna do some golden Next on the list, we're going to do some Lady Amherst, just the neck feathers that just come like this. I'm going to go for a pretty mid-sized, middle of the way up the neck feather. I don't want something too short because then it really won't show up when the front station of the fly is made. So I do definitely want these to kind of protrude back to, almost to where the end of my hook guide is here. So I'm just going to tie this in at the tip. I'm going to tie the end of the feather up the tube a bit just to make sure that I'm kind of keeping a nice even body, so when I do my wrap for the body, it actually has the same taper the whole way through. If I can cut this. All right. hackle pliers can come in handy with this stuff because they're a bit short. And 3 wraps I think is going to just about be everything I need. I'm going to tie that off. Nice tight wraps. Make sure you have sharp scissors. Make sure this is nice and secured. I don't want this going anywhere. And these tend to kind of get trapped on wrapping because they're pretty long. So I like to come in with a bodkin and clear out and make sure all these things are separated all nicely. All right. Next on the list, we're going to do some ostrich. I'm going to use the back portion here where the feathers, or where the fibers of the feather are kind of fluffy, whereas at the top here, they're way thinner. They look almost like rhea. I kind of want some density to these. So I'm going to do about 6 fibers. It's going to kind of be different every fly you tie or what feather you're using because each one's different. So I'm going to tie these on the side, directly on the side, and I want these to go just past my hook guide, just about to where my hook's going to end. There's one side. I'm going to tie the ends all the way up the tube, come back. So there's one side. Do the same exact amount on the other side, or as close as you can. That was a bit much. Get rid of one of those. And you want these all to be the same length. Sometimes when you cut them, they can kind of be different lengths, especially if the feather is kind of not an A tier feather. So I want these to be the same length. I'm going to tie them in. Wrap these up the tube again. And you'll notice by the time I tied all these materials forward, the body will be the same diameter the whole way through, or as close as I can. That way there's not a huge bump where you cut all your materials here and the rest of the tube would be super skinny. All right, next for our back station, we're going to tie in our grizzly hackle. I want to take 2 tips from each side, so that way as I'm using this, I use the material evenly and don't end up with a bunch of odds and ends. So it's about the size I want. So I kind of want to see what I want for a length. I like these pretty long. I mean, the reason I tie these in, not only that they look cool, they also really have a lot of different motion that the ostrich and the marabou is not going to have. So I kind of like these to be long so that they really get some movement when they're in the water. So I think that's about the length I'm going to go for. And I'm going to peel off the fibers right where I want to tie it in. So I'm going to trim these back. When I tie these in, I like to actually tie a little bit of the feather in with the stem. That way it helps as much as you can to have this sit flat against the side of the hook. Otherwise it'll tend to want to spin on you, and that doesn't look the way I'm wanting this thing to be. So tie this in, nice tight wraps. And I want this to curve towards the hook. These kind of curve in 2 ways naturally. I'm looking to have it curve towards where the hook is going to be. Now I'm going to tie in the other side. Just going to spin my vise. If you have a rotary, this will make it a little bit easier. trim it. All right, just putting some thread wraps down to make sure that everything's sitting nice and flush for my body. And that's looking all right. Can sometimes be a little bit of a battle getting these to sit the way you want, but those are looking fine to me. So now for my body material, I'm gonna use mini fly flat braid, although there's a lot of things you can do for this. You can use Flashabou, you can use pretty much any kind of flat, flashy surface. This is just what I like to use. Tie it in. Do exactly what I've been doing this whole time and tying this up the body of the fly. And when I wrap back, I'm gonna wrap all the way back to where I finished tying in my materials. And then that's gonna leave my body starting right at the tail of the fly. So I'm gonna wrap up. I'm looking to do about that much of a body, I think. Now you could put saddle hackle and wrap this up the hook. I personally like just doing the body with the straight tinsel or Flashabou, whatever you decide to use, based on that the more material you add within the fly, the harder it is for it to sink. So, with the body just being a flat tinsel, that's going to leave a lot of room for water to penetrate the fly and to make it sink a bit easier. All right, so I'm going to wrap this forward. All right, tie it off. All right, next on our list is going to be another dubbing ball. And this one's actually going to be a bit smaller than the back just because we're also tying in some Arctic fox. So I want to make sure I leave some room for that. Just a little more ice dub, same color as the rear station. Do the same thing, pull these fibers towards each other. Make sure they line up as much as you can. And I actually want a little bit more material than that. All right. And then I'm going to use my bodkin, kind of straighten these out once they're in the loop if they need to be evened out at all. going to pick this one out just a little bit more, make sure there's room for the fox, and just wrap this the same way we did the last one. All right, next is going to be some fox, Arctic fox. I have some here in white. You could do this with pink as well, and that would look great. I don't want to go too much with the fox because this is going to be one of the contributors to making this fly sink very poorly. The more you add, the harder for it is to sink. So I'm really going to go pretty sparse with this if I can. That looks about the right amount to me. I'm just checking the lengths to make sure that I don't go too far back, because I really just want this for a prop. I don't really want it for too much else. So that's about the length I'm going for. I want this to go just about to the back of my body here, right where the rear station starts. Gonna trim this. Set it aside, make my dubbing loop. All right, grab your fox, stick it in a loop. Pull this apart, make sure all the fibers are pretty separated, so when you spin this, it gets a good spin. It doesn't stay loose in the loop and fall out when you're trying to wrap it. I'm leaving maybe a 1/4 of an inch to a 1/2 inch on the opposite side of the loop. I'm gonna pick this out with a bodkin, make sure that all separated. Pull out a little bit. That was a little excessive with the fox. All right, ready to spin it. Maybe just a little bit less tag in. There we go. I'm going to pick out this fox, make sure everything isn't trapped inside of the loop itself. And I'm just going to pull this back. You can wet it too. The more you wet it though, the less of a shoulder I find it builds. So I like to keep it dry or wet it very slightly. I'm putting all these wraps pretty much one after the next. Not too much space in between each wrap. All right, tie it off. Maybe a little bit more Arctic fox than I was planning on having, but it'll have a big shoulder. We're all right with that. I come back at it one more time and just pick this thing out, make sure everything's separated. All right, next on our list is some more Lady Amherst. I want a longer feather than I had in the back because the front station is going to be a bit larger. So I'm going to have this end. Nice. I want this feather to be a bit longer because the front station is a bit larger. So I'm going to have this end go pretty much to the midpoint of the rear station here. And that's going to be one of the longest feathers in the neck that you receive. So I'm going to draw this feather back like so, kind of see where the longest fibers end up, and that is about where I want them. Going to tie this in at the tip just like I did on the last. I'm actually going to trim the, as you can see on this feather, a lot of these have the nice black tips, but at the end where you're actually going to be holding this, none of those have that coloration. So I'm actually going to trim all those out. This kind of does two things. It lets me hold on to the feather a little bit easier, and also you don't accidentally tie in those fibers you might not want. So anyway, tie this in once again. And we're going to start palmering. It's about two or three wraps. Works just great for this stuff. The further into the feather you get, the thicker the stem is, and I don't like the way that looks so much. In fact, this one was a little bit too much of a wrap. So let's bring this back. Tie it in a little bit further back. I like to draw all the feathers back when I'm tying them in. Trim out our stem. So there's our front. There's our front Lady Amherst. I'll run the bodkin through it really quick. Just make sure all those are separated. All right. So it's time for our ostrich. Going to use the same feather I was using for the rear station, except this time I'm going to use all these long, more Rhea-esque kind of fibers up at the front. And I'm going to measure these out and kind of see how long I want this to be. So I want this to essentially end just past or about at the end of my rear station. You can go maybe a little bit further back. I kind of want these ostrich fibers to protrude further than the Marabou is going to. So a little bit longer, in my opinion, is better than shorter, because otherwise you're not really going to see it as well. So measure these out. And kind of a trick, which sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't, but if you pull all these back the opposite way they're going on the feather and then trim straight, the ends will line up a bit easier than if you just trimmed them straight off, because they taper as they go up. As you can see, some of these fibers are still not 100% straight, so you can match these up to your desire, get as nitpicky as you want. And I want a little bit more ostrich than this, so I'm going to set this down and trim a bit more off. Again, just pull these feathers back and then trim straight up the stem. Might have been a little bit too much, but as you can see, those are pretty straight. couple strays. And then set them down with the ends lining up. And it's not necessarily bad if all of these aren't exactly the same length. In fact, they'll be a little bit different. It'll look a lot more natural than if it was a completely straight feather, or straight series of fibers rather. So measure these out. See where you want them to end is about there. Set this down actually again. Make my dubbin loop. This is where some dubbing wax can be really handy, but you can manage without. All right, once I have these measured out, I'm gonna trim them. And give yourself a little bit extra. As this spins, it tends to kind of compress the fibers, or the length of the fibers, so you'll end up with a bit shorter collection of feathers than you thought you did. So trim these out. There's my length. And I'm just gonna put these in the loop. And I have them as a clump right now. When I put them in is when I like to spread them out. And a bodkin works great for this. You'll probably lose a few along the way. I'm going to spin this up. And if you spin this in, or if you tie this in and you notice that one side of your fly is missing ostrich, you can always tie in 1 or 2 fibers. Just want to make sure this is nice and tight so that I don't lose any of these. Try to split these as best as you can. Should have got some water, but I didn't. All right, and start wrapping. And every time I wrap, I like to pull these back and make sure they're sitting sitting flush with the hooks so that they don't get trapped with the next wrap. There's all my ostrich. It's looking good. I'm going to do just a couple more wraps with the end of the loop, make sure that that's all tied in, and tie this in. All right, pull all these back and do some more tight wraps. Come in with your bodkin, or a brush can work great too. Just pick all those out. All right, it's looking good. Next thing we're gonna do is some pink marabou. You're really looking for something with a thin stem that makes it easier to palmer this. And you're also looking for a feather that's long enough. Some of your woolly bugger marabou won't be long enough to really do a full hackle like you're wanting it to be. So this, as you can see, the ends of this feather line up pretty much right before the ends of my my ostrich here. So this should look killer. So you can see there's a really fluffy bit of the marabou at the tag end. I'm going to trim all that out or pull it out. I really just want the nice, crisp ends of these. Yeah, so that's the kind of feather you're looking for right there. Tie it in at the tip again. Now this stuff is super fragile, so I kind of like to leave the tip in so that I don't accidentally pull it through, but it can break rather easily, so just be wary of that. And as I'm doing this, I'm pulling the ostrich back to make sure that all the ostrich is kind of behind my marabou. And you will trap fibers from the marabou as you're palmering it. We'll pick that out after we're done here. I think I'm going to use this whole feather. I'm going to tie it in. Only going to do 3 wraps really right now to tie it in first. And then I'm going to bring in my bodkin and really dig in there and pull out all those feathers or all those fibers to make sure that they're all separated, because with marabou that's important. That's where all the movement comes from. If it's all trapped, it's not going to move the same. So once I've done that to my liking, I'm going to do a few more wraps, really just make sure this is tied in. And I'm going to trim my tag end that I tied in at the beginning. And there's our marabou. The last thing on this fly is going to be our schlappen as our finishing feather. So I'm looking for a feather that is long, because this is a pretty large fly, but not something that's going to overwhelm our marabou and all our other materials. So that's about the length that I'm looking for right there. I'm going to trim away all the fluffy end of the schlappen. So that I end up with something that looks like that. And I only want about that much material. We're going to tie it in again, tip first. And seat it right up against the marabou. I want to try to blend this as much as I can. And start wrapping. Your finishing feather gives you the opportunity to clean up any imperfections and thread buildup you have at the back of your fly, so that you end up with a nice clean head. Take a step back here, make sure I'm covering everything. There's our schlappen. Tie that in. Nice tight wraps. Schlappen, I really find it important again to just pick out all your materials, make sure they're all separated. do the completely useless thing of blowing on your fly. As you can see, there's a little end there. I'll pull that out. Looking good. All right, so I'm actually going to tie this off now. Three-turn whip finish or so. Come in with some head cement. All right, for the last bit of this fly, I'm going to use this Pro Sport Fisher Pro Cone in silver or nickel. Slide this on nice and tight to the front of your fly. Just gonna push this forward. Try to get it off the mandrel here. Don't worry if your hook guide comes off, you can always put that back on. Try not to have a bunch of dubbing that's gonna burn. Use the lighter. Trim the end. A bit tighter. Nice. Just want to make sure you don't have too much material on the end of this. I should really have sharp scissors for this. Oh my. There we go. Okay. All right. Take it to the lighter. I'm going to use my fingers and pull all of that material back. I don't want this getting singed in the lighter. Use the blue part of the flame. Stick it back the opposite way on the mandrel. Make sure that's all got enough room for your fishing line. And there you go. There's a simple little two-stage intruder. This has been one of my favorites out on the coast, and a great winter steelhead fly. Thanks for joining. Hope you liked it.